Good morning and welcome to our Shared Value Summer Series. Last summer, we welcomed several hundred leaders, influencers, visionaries, and change makers into a series of conversations about our identity as a region and about our aspirations for reinventing this Richmond region as a place where everyone can thrive. I'm Brian Anderson, President of the Chamber RVA, and we welcome you here this morning for this continued conversation. We're going to continue this summer conversation with, based on the inspired Brookings report, From Commitment to Action, How CEOs can advance racial equity in their regional economies. Share with you before today's event. We've all witnessed how businesses have stepped up their support for communities of color, but these actions are now going further and extending beyond philanthropy to changing internal business practices, catalyzing transformational projects with other CEOs, and working through civic and community organizations to advance inclusive economic growth. Today, I'm excited that we'll hear from two national phenomenal speakers, including the author of the report, who will offer practical research, inspiring examples of business leaders thinking differently and acting collectively across the country, and most importantly, concrete steps that we, the Richmond leadership, can take to move from commitment to action. Before we get started, I want to thank our board members who are participating today, our incredible community partners, and our sponsors. This session is made possible through the support of dozens of local organizations that are dedicated to the growth and success of the Richmond region. They are highlighted on the screen that you're seeing now. We want to especially thank Dominion Energy for their continued support of these conversations, and also want to thank JMI and welcome them today to this series. We want to hear from James Warren, Vice President of Brand Strategy at JMI. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome to all of today's speakers and attendees. My name is James Warren again, and I'm the Vice President of Brand Strategy at JMI. And on behalf of our company, we're really grateful for the opportunity to support such an important initiative. Looking back over the last year and a half, we realized that many businesses and organizations have made commitments, and some have begun to even take concerted actions to address longstanding racial inequities and health and economic disparities, locally, regionally, and even nationally. While our first set of conversations focused on commitments and actions that were largely external, today's conversation is about taking a moment to be reflective and think about how we can start making change within our own companies through our own business practices. As business leaders, we have the responsibility to our teams, employees, and community to be a safe and welcoming place for people to bring their full selves and create their best selves. I encourage all of us to be open, honest, and courageous as we take a look at our business practices. And when done with the right mindset, it will be an enlightening experience, helping you discover or clarify your purpose and direction. We cannot thank the Chamber enough for hosting these important conversations. Through the inaugural Shared Value Conversation Series, the Chamber brought the business community together to help us decide who we want to be. And now through this second series, the Chamber has created a framework that will help us push the region forward together to create a positive impact. The value that these conversations bring to the region is enormous in helping to set us on a course where Richmond is a place that serves all of us. At JMI, we have a deep love for our community, and that's where our work is about as a marketing and consulting firm, connecting brands, cultures, and communities. We partner with companies and organizations that take building and investing in genuine community relationships seriously and want to use their influence to better the region and the people in it. At our firm, we value authenticity, curiosity, and passion. Authenticity tells us to acknowledge what is true. Curiosity makes us wonder what can be done better. And it is our passion that pushes us to go after what we believe is right. We're happy to be part of these conversations to help make our region the best it can be for everyone. Thank you.
James, thanks again for being with us today. And more importantly, your partnership. We enjoy working with your firm on many different priorities, and we continue to want to do that as we go forward. I also want to mention a couple of housekeeping notes for today's session. First, we're recording all of these series sessions so that we can share them on our Shared Value program page of our website at the conclusion of the event. So you can find those recordings later. If you have a question for today for our speakers, please submit it using the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring that so we can make sure that our guests have those questions to respond to at the end of the event. So to get us started today, I'm also excited to introduce a leader who is somewhat new to the region, maybe by a couple months, but he's already making a tremendous impact on the greater Richmond region and the University of Richmond. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mickey Quinones, Dean and Professor of Management of the Robbins School of Business at the University of Richmond, and one of our newest board members for Chamber RVA. Welcome, Dr. McQuinones.
Thanks, Brian. Good morning, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and participate in this really important conversation. I'm really excited and energized by this as a relatively new Chamber RVA board member. As you mentioned, I was here about 3 months before that, so before you got here, but I guess a long timer by that statement. And I've also been a member of the DEI task force, and I'm really excited to talk about the growing commitment of the Chamber RVA to ensure that our business community thinks and acts differently about how they hire, support, promote, procure, and invest to create opportunities for everyone in our region. Now, since moving to Richmond, and I know what your experience has been, but I have experienced a very dynamic and welcoming business community, a community that is always looking for ways to be better and to do more. And I found that spirit to be in full display during our DEI task force meetings. There was a palpable sense of urgency and a deep desire to be part of the solution. And I think the Shared Value series, in which this is part, is an example of that commitment. Now, during this past tumultuous years, it became clear to all of us that we could no longer deny the glaring inequalities that exist in our society. The reality that our current economic system and business practices need to work for all segments of our community was evident for all of us to see. As Heather McGhee points out in her book, The Sum of Us, we need to move beyond the belief that progress for one group must come at the expense of another to the realization that when everyone is included, we all prosper. This zero-sum thinking actually hurts us all. And I think this belief in the power of inclusive growth is what drives our conversation today. It underpins the foundation of what we're going to be discussing today. Now, over this past decade or so, there's been mounting evidence of the positive impact of diversity and inclusion in organizations. We know that there's increased dynamism and creativity that comes from having different experiences and perspectives when making decisions. We also know that there's a reality that in an increasingly diverse country, people want to work in organizations that represent this diversity. And businesses have sought, as a result of this reality, to find ways to make their cultures more inclusive and their employee base more representative. And so, as you mentioned this morning, we're just incredibly fortunate to have two very prominent thought leaders who have devoted their professional careers to ensuring that our communities and businesses deliver on the promise of inclusive growth and prosperity. We'll first hear from Amy Liu, Director of the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program and co-author of the report that hopefully you all had a chance to read. Amy has a background in social policy and urban studies and is a national expert on cities and metropolitan areas. As director of Brookings Metro, which she co-founded in 1996, Amy pioneered an approach to studying cities and urban areas that relies on rigorous research to inform strategies for economic growth and opportunity. She's a prolific writer on the topic of inclusive growth, outlining, for example, ways that state and local leaders can rebuild better and achieve a more equitable economic recovery after the COVID-19 crisis. Now, her work on the recovery of New Orleans post-Katrina informs state and local leaders on the ingredients required to create resilient communities. And boy, haven't we all had to be resilient this past year. Amy is frequently cited in many of our nation's top media outlets, such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, and NPR. She served as a special advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, as well as a special assistant to HUD Secretary Henry Cisneros. Actually, someone with whom I'm very familiar, having grown up in San Antonio, where Henry Cisneros served as mayor before becoming secretary. So Amy, this morning, will be discussing the report's framework for action, its key learnings, and focus that lens on the Richmond region, providing us with data and opportunities for improvement that we can all take as we try to make our economic region work for more groups and more individuals. Now, following Amy's presentation, we will hear from Rodney Sampson, one of Amy's colleagues at Brookings, where he serves as a non-resident fellow. He's also the founder and CEO of Opportunity Hub, a leading multi-campus working space, entrepreneurship center, tech hub, startup pre-accelerator, coding bootcamp, scholarship initiative, and angel investing platform for founders from underestimated and undertapped communities. Rodney's mission is to to ensure that everyone, everywhere, particularly socially disadvantaged communities, have equitable access to wealth creation opportunities. As a highly successful entrepreneur, Rodney has co-founded startup companies that have raised millions in angel and venture capital, created hundreds of new jobs, and generated tens of millions in revenue before being acquired or going public. So he clearly knows what he's talking about. Now, he uses his experience to work with startups, scale-ups, and large firms to ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion is operationalized across the businesses and company culture. His current investment and an advisory portfolio include Cross-Culture Ventures, TechSquare, Capital, Digit, York Exponential, Plum.io, the Mentor Method, and Momentum Learning. Now, Rodney is also a professor of entrepreneurship at Morehouse College and recently launched a collaboration with UNC's Keenan Flagler School of Business on a groundbreaking certification program whose aim is to create more equitable, inclusive organizations in entrepreneurial ecosystems. So after Amy's presentation, Rodney will be sharing his solutions audit that helps organizations review the extent to which DEI is present in areas ranging from corporate governance to human resource to procurement and community impact. And we will then wrap up with a conversation among the three of us, where we'll also be taking your questions and addressing your questions. So make sure that you submit your questions through the Q&A function, which I'll be monitoring and incorporating into our discussion. And we want to make sure that you have your continued engagement throughout the morning. So now, please help me in welcoming Amy Leung. Morning, Amy.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Mickey, for that wonderful introduction, and Brian for your leadership at the Chamber RVA. I really do want to applaud all of you and the Chamber RVA members and partners on the journey that you've been together over the past year. It's truly an important reflection of your shared values and your commitment to racial equity and inclusive growth in this moment. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump in and share my screen. Great. So my understanding is that you all want to turn your journey into a concrete set of actions to advance a more just and prosperous economy for Greater Richmond. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to give you a framework for action based on the paper you've heard about. And it's a framework of action for a collection of employers and community leaders to work together around a more equitable economy. And I'm going to give you some emerging examples around the country that I hope will inspire your work together in this community. So let me start by acknowledging, let's see, hold on a second. Hold on a second. I'm going to try this again. So let me start by acknowledging that since the murder of George Floyd about a year ago, as Mickey said, there's been corporations and private sectors that have certainly stepped up to support racial justice causes, and more recently stand up for voting rights and participatory democracy. Now, these visible commitments and stances have been matched by public demand. There's a poll conducted last year by Just Capital, which is a nonprofit dedicated to stakeholder capitalism, that found that 75% of Americans, including consumers and employees, they want their corporations to condemn racism and racial injustices. And most of them want those awards to not just be a set of values, but to be matched by action. And so when you match by action, what employers ought to do, as Mickey sort of said at the beginning, is you have to have a culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And there are many studies that have shown the competitive benefits of doing so, including the fact that having a strong DEI culture helps attract and retain talent. So that first statistic there is that 67% of job seekers, especially young professionals, place a high premium on choosing employers that prioritize DEI when they look for a job. And my bet is that demand has increased since the events of 2020, which is why I think a recent survey by Benevity of 1,000 employees during the pandemic is so fascinating. And that's the remainder of the statistics here. They found that 49% of employees said they are less likely to engage in in-person work if their workplace is not inclusive. And 37% said that they're likely to quit their jobs post-pandemic if their companies fail to address racial equity as a top corporate culture priority. And that sentiment to quit the company rises to 55% and 47% for Hispanic and Black employees. Yet despite all these benefits, the concern is that many of these highly visible corporate announcements have not yielded deeper systemic reforms that impact the lives of real people and real places. You know, there was a McKinsey report released at the end of 2020 that found that among the 1,000 largest companies, 1/3, yes, did make public statements in support of racial justice, yet a smaller slice, only 18%, made changes internally, such as in the board composition, in staffing, and product development, which are actions that would have deeper, more sustained changes in the marketplace. And I would add, and I think for the purposes of our conversation today, we also need to see more systemic changes in communities, in the places like Greater Richmond, in which people seek opportunity, create a good life for future generations of their family. The cities you see here, they have galvanized a nation. These are cities in which George Floyd and Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, Ma'Khia Bryant tried to succeed. And they are not alone. Pictured here are historic neighborhoods in these cities where immigrants, African Americans, and low income workers call home. And you all know that to improve the opportunity structure in communities, in places, requires intentional coordinated action among employers, government, nonprofit partners, philanthropy. This includes creating good jobs and inclusive workplaces, equipping workers for those jobs, and ensuring neighborhoods provide the quality housing and transportation options that support employment and entrepreneurship. Now, this kind of systemic change in these kind of places is hard to do with siloed corporate investments at the national level or ad hoc hiring goals by local employers. So how can CEOs and their community partners move from commitment to action to together advance racial equity in their home regions? Now, in my essay, I propose 3 sets of actions that CEOs can take. You can adopt internal corporate changes. You can act as a coalition of CEOs around a set of shared quantifiable goals and actions. And as board members, you can drive change through influential civic organizations like the Chamber RVA. So let's start with the internal business changes first. Now, CEOs can undertake an internal audit of their firm's diversity, equity, and inclusion performance. And we start, by the way, on internal business changes first because it's where the credibility begins on the commitment to DEI. Now, you're going to hear from Rodney Sampson in a moment. I like Rodney Sampson's 7-part audit, which is shown here. Rodney uses this in his work with startups, scale-ups, and large tech firms so that DEI shows up in the business culture on day one and every day. In short, the values of DEI ought to be operationalized in corporate boards and governance, among hiring, promotion, and HR practices, in corporate procurement and vendor services, in corporate innovation and product development, so that firms are developing products and solutions that matter and meet the needs of a more diverse customer base, in the resources that firms commit to go to market and reach more diverse audiences, and yes, in investment and community impact so that firms invest in and empower Black and Hispanic businesses and communities either through equity, partnerships, or philanthropy. And I know that Rodney's going to come up on this stage shortly and talk about what he calls this DAIS model and what this work looks like in practice. Now, secondly, imagine what you could do as a coalition of CEOs. As I said earlier, it's really hard to change the structure of opportunity for large numbers of workers or families as an individual company. But if a group of CEOs committed to change regional KPIs in partnership with public and nonprofit sector partners, then I think you can meaningfully shift how things are done inside companies, in civic strategies, in policies that are aligned to create change at greater scale towards a racially inclusive economy. So collective action is going to matter because the greater Richmond economy is struggling. It's struggling to be dynamic, prosperous, and racially inclusive, lagging behind most peer regions with over 1 million people in population. And on racial inclusion specifically, what's happening is that the earnings gap between white workers and Black workers has actually widened in the last 10 years, primarily because white earnings have improved while the earnings for African American workers has actually stagnated. Meanwhile, the earnings of Hispanic workers are beginning to gain ground. Now, in response, what Richmond area executives could do is work together to set regional goals, including quantifiable targets and an action plan to move the needle in 3 areas: in talent, supplier diversity, and community wealth, each of which could contribute to the region's economic growth and dynamism, productivity, and inclusion. Now, on talent, CEOs in Greater Richmond could aim to increase the representation of Black and Hispanic workers in key occupations. Now, we chose management and tech represented as computer math occupations because I think doing so would ensure that diverse viewpoints are found in employer and operational strategies and decisions, and that diverse talent is employed in the growing job openings in this post-COVID digital economy. So there are two sets of bars here. What you'll see is on the left is management occupations, on the right is computer and math occupations. In both, what you'll see is that African Americans and Hispanics make up 29% and 6.2% of the labor force, respectively, in the Richmond region. However, Black and Hispanic workers are highly underrepresented in management positions in Greater Richmond. And when I say management positions, I don't just mean C-suite positions. I mean accounting managers, marketing managers, logistic managers, and other mid-level management roles that play an important role in our companies. Black and Hispanic workers are also woefully underrepresented in the high demand computer science occupations in our economy, or in this economy in particular. And I want to stress that most of these jobs do not require someone to have a 4-year college degree, but yes, they do have to have specialized credentials in data analytics, computer programming, or IT support services. And so one goal that Richmond area CEOs could set is to perhaps double the share of Black and Hispanic workers in one or both of these occupations, so that these workers better reflect their overall representation in the workforce. And this is exactly something that the Metro Milwaukee Chamber has done to make their community, quote, a region of choice. Employers and business executives have agreed to work together to increase the employment rate of Black and Hispanic workers by 15% by 2025, and to increase the share of Black, Hispanic, Latino managers in the region by 25%. And what they're doing is starting with revising companies' internal employment and recruitment practices first. In Seattle, a group of CEOs recently forged a coalition to tackle racial equity together. And I think what's relevant here is that this coalition, involving Microsoft, Starbucks, and others, has set goals nearly all focused on talent development and are in the process of developing strategies and programs to achieve these goals. So what you see here is that these goals include employing a workforce that reflects Black communities and other communities of colors, achieving racial parity in compensation, increasing Black representation in management and leadership positions, increasing internships and workplace learning for young Black students. Okay, another option is that this region CEOs could also commit to expand supplier diversity, which is abysmal nationally. And one way to tackle this is to increase the share of Black-owned enterprises in the region through venture capital and partnerships. And I know Rodney will have ideas on that. This chart shows that while African Americans make up 31% of this region's total population, they are owners of less than 5% of all firms. So enormous progress can be made here. So in Birmingham, 10 CEOs joined the mayor in a commitment to supplier diversity. What they launched was VITAL, which stands for Valuing Inclusion to Accelerate Lift. And what they started was with a commitment to collect and make transparent business and government procurement data as a first step in understanding how they're doing so far, to then reform their vendor relationships. And the results of that work was actually just released earlier this year. And what they found was that the 10 VITAL companies learned that just 25% of their spending was actually local. And within that, just 12% of their total corporate spend was dedicated to minority and women-owned businesses. So with this baseline information, these businesses and other partners can now make some informed steps to set goals and strategies to do better for their Black business ecosystem. Now, the third option is that CEOs could come together to promote community wealth in key neighborhoods. And this chart shows that the income gap between the highest and lowest earning neighborhoods in the Richmond region have actually closed slightly in recent years, which is good. But what is so concerning to me is how wide the income gap is between these sets of neighborhoods. And I show this data mostly as a proxy because every region across the country has areas of advantage and disadvantage that contributes to multi-generational inequality. So what CEOs of Richmond could do is band together to increase small business development, quality employment, home ownership, or other investments in overlooked neighborhoods to move the needle on income and wealth creation. And that is exactly what a group of headquarter companies and others like Hyatt, Mars Wrigley, AT&T in Chicago are committing to do. In Chicago, there's a new group called the Corporate Coalition. It formed to specifically reduce the severe inequalities in the Chicago region, including investing in key neighborhoods to build wealth for Black and Brown communities. And what I like about their commitment is that they're explicit about reducing inequalities through their core business functions and operations, such as talent acquisition, supply chain, vendor relationships, and site location. So what you see here are the three starting activities of the Corporate Coalition. And I want to focus on the second and third, which are interrelated and specifically aim to improve opportunities on the south and west side of Chicago, which is their historically disadvantaged areas. Both the Corporate Connector and the EPIC Fund aim to help catalytic real estate projects in these neighborhoods, whether it's commercial, industrial products, mixed use developments with restaurant, retail, community services. They're created and led by communities of color, helping these catalytic projects truly succeed and create meaningful economic and wealth creating opportunities for their residents. So what the EPIC Fund does is invest sorely needed equity investments, not just debt capital, into these critical community projects. And then the Corporate Connector then connects these projects with expertise, talent, facilities, purchasing power, such as vendor relationships with these area corporations, because it takes more than just financial capital to make these community projects really endure. So I believe you're going to have an opportunity to learn more from the Chicago Coalition leaders in a future event in this series, which I would encourage you to do because I think it'll be quite informative. And I want to close this section by noting that in the past year, a number of regional CEO groups have actually formed to tackle racial equity together. So this idea of collective action is on the rise, whether it's the Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity, the Washington Employers Group, which I just talked about, Business Equity for Indy, the Corporate Coalition Chicago, the Columbus Partnership. Each of these organizations are dividing strategies now to move the needle meaningfully in their communities, and it's certainly these are certainly innovations to watch. Last section is that the last thing you can do as CEOs is also use your influence as board members of powerful civic organizations like chambers to make sure that staff of these groups are doing their part to advance racial equity and economic competitiveness. So let me share a few examples of what peers to Chamber RVA are doing on this front. Now, in Indianapolis, the Indy Chamber is an example of a holistic approach to economic and racial equity. With the support of its board, the Chamber has adopted an inclusive economic growth strategy where the values of DEI are actually embedded in what has been traditional economic development programs. So for instance, the Indy Chamber launched an inclusive incentives program, which I think is a model for others that rewards firms that create family sustaining jobs and reward firms that invest in programs that remove barriers for workers to access those jobs, such as a workforce, childcare, and transit. They have a partnership with the Department of Corrections to help returning citizens launch new businesses. And they have been serving as a CDFI during the pandemic, helping primarily women and minority-owned small businesses access loans and technical services. Portland Means Progress is a new collaboration among the local economic development group, Prosper Portland, the city, and the workforce intermediaries. This collaboration is executing initiatives in 3 ways to ensure that Portland means building a strong homegrown diverse workforce through internships and apprenticeships, that Portland means supporting diverse small businesses through supplier diversity programs, and that Portland means embracing a workplace culture of diversity, equity, inclusion through services they provide to member companies. So really great, exciting initiatives underway there. And another thing that even the Chamber RVA can do is something that Cincinnati Chamber is doing is just to build the capacity to execute on one of these critical strategies for the region, say on supplier diversity. And in this case, the Cincinnati Regional Chamber houses one of the most promising and effective minority business accelerators in the country. And what's unique about this program is it doesn't target sort of neighborhood serving businesses, but Black and Brown owned firms with at least $1 million in revenue. So these are focused on portfolio of companies that actually are scalable that have the chance to create quality jobs and build wealth for Black and Latino entrepreneurs, and then have the capacity to actually enter into partnerships with larger incumbent firms. Because of that work, Cincinnati MBA has now supported 67 minority-owned mid-sized businesses that have together generated about $1.5 billion in aggregate revenue. So I'm just going to close with this, which is that the commitment to racial equity and economic competitiveness is not a fad. An increasing number of business groups and economic development groups across the country are embracing inclusive economic growth as the new competitiveness agenda in the country. In fact, there's a scramble now among regions on who will be the best at economic and racial inclusion. This includes Denver, Indianapolis, San Diego, Greater Washington, D.C., and many others. In fact, I think this group is going to hear from the Greater Washington Partnership as part of this program series, and they literally have declared that their goal is to be the #1 region on inclusive growth. So I hope that all of you as leaders in Greater Richmond do move from commitment to action so that your Black and Latino entrepreneurs and workers and communities are really at the heart of your dynamic, prosperous post-COVID economy. Thank you very much. And with that, I am really excited to turn the program over to my great friend and person I admire, Rodney Sampson.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, everyone. Amy, thank you for your presentation and the opportunity to work alongside you on a day-to-day basis at the Brookings Institution. To the leadership of the Richmond Chamber, good morning to you, to the Board of Directors, and to all of those that have joined us this morning. My name is Rodney Sampson. I serve as a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and I'm also executive chairman of Opportunity Hub and general partner at 100 Black Angels and Allies Fund. So for the next 15 or 20 minutes, I want to really double click on some of the things that Amy was talking about, particularly as it relates to operationalizing diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions in your business or entity. But I want to start by giving some context because particularly this year, and of course, particularly last year, there was a lot of new conversations or renewed conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And having been in this work for almost 2 decades now, I often look back and determine what is performative, what is just for press, versus what is actually measurable, what is sacrificial, and what is actually moving the needle. And so I want to give you some context here. By 2053, the projected median wealth of a Black family in America will be 0. And by 2073, for Latinx families, basically, candidly, what it's saying is that everything we're doing is not working. We're going backwards and we're not going forward. Per McKinsey, Black America will lose 4.5 million jobs due to automation this decade. And that has now been accelerated because of COVID-19. If you look at the technology ecosystem, in particular, the racial gap in tech is 1.1 million Black and Latinx Americans. And that's costing these respective communities $50 billion annually. That's $1 trillion in the next 20 years. Last year, we saw 39% unemployment in the Black community at the beginning of the pandemic. In the startup ecosystem, we saw less than 1% of all venture capital, $156 billion that was invested in approximately 11,000 firms last year. Less than 1% of that capital went to Black founders. And according to the research by our friends at Harlem Capital, there have only been 305 Black and Latinx high growth companies to have ever raised over 1 million in venture capital. And that's over the last 20 plus years. And I happen to be one of the first persons on that list. So think about that, 305 in the last 20 plus years compared to over 11,000 in 2019 and about 11,000 in 2020. So I want you to see the gaps. So it's clear that equity and racial equity in particular should be at the center of any and all economic opportunity as a driver of shared prosperity and new multi-generational wealth creation with no reliance on pre-existing multi-generational wealth as we speed into the fourth industrial revolution. And I emphatically believe that a framework for measurable, metrics-driven internal and external investments, and the key word is investments, in diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions is key. So to kick this off a little bit, I want you to envision you were attending the annual awards gala at your company, or maybe it's the retreat. And there's a dinner before the celebration. And on the dais, there were members of your company and guests that were going to be receiving awards. What would your dais look like if we were measuring racial equity? What would it look like if we were reporting, if your company was reporting, or maybe a public source or platform was reporting? Would you be proud of your dais? So for a few minutes, I want to jump in and provide some practical solutions on how you can operationalize dais in your organization to advance racial equity. The first area is corporate governance. And it's interesting here. I have often conversations often with one of my board members, David Will IV, who's former vice chairman of NASDAQ. And David called me last year, and David and I have known each other for nearly a decade. He came to our first Kingonomics conference in Washington, DC, and we've been good friends ever since. And David called me up and said, you know, Rodney, I've done a lot of thinking, and just kind of given the influence and the wealth and privilege that I've been afforded to have and to be around and to help generate in my roles, I don't think I've done enough. Can you help me simply, just like, you know, without all of, you know, the pontification and all of the methodologies, what can I simply do or advise my colleagues that I am proximate to do to advance racial equity in the economy and through business? And so together, David and I started to work through and kind of revisit a lot of things that could be simply done in organizations. At the level of corporate governance, it's kind of simple. Just add Black, Latinx, and Indigenous members to your board and compensate them equitably. And you don't have to ask questions like, well, I want them to be qualified. Of course, I mean, that's a given. Being qualified to work or being qualified for roles and positions is key. You know, although throughout history, we have known that a lot of people have been, you know, appointed to things and have not been qualified. So, you know, to sort of say like, yes, we would love to hire more Black and brown folks, you know, in our company at the board level, but they got to be qualified. Like, don't say that, you know. Of course, they have to be qualified. Create a dais audit committee so that you can measure, research, and audit dais in your organization and have it be owned by someone on the board and not automatically the Black, Latinx, and Indigenous person that you just added to your board, but someone at the highest level, the highest fiduciary of the organization should ultimately be responsible for dais. And I'll tell you why, because, you know, McKinsey and others, Case Foundation and others have shown where economic output has been higher, 35% when ethnic minorities are in positions of power, decision-making power in an organization. And when women have the power to make decisions or on decision-making teams, it's 15%. I mean, you know, I could argue that if it's a Black woman, it'd be 45%, but that's for you to decide. But my point is, if in business, we're about our mission, we're about our customers, and ultimately we're about economic output for our shareholders and the economy, then it's our fiduciary to ensure that we can increase economic output. All right, let's move to the next one, and I'll move through these pretty quickly. Really quick, let me drop some resources in so you can follow up at a later date, so you don't have to capture all of this stuff now as well, if you want to double click on this in your respective work. The next thing in DAIS is talent, human resources. Hire more Black recruiters, hire Latinx recruiters, hire Black women, hire Latinx women to recruit in your organization, because they'll have access to networks that perhaps your non-Black and Latinx team members do not have. Work with Black-owned talent placement firms like OHUB and Act One, founded by Janice Bryant Howard, to source and recruit talent for your organization. Partner with talent support organizations that can help you partner with minority serving institutions or historically Black colleges and universities, community colleges. Coding boot camps are now a new source of talent. Maybe it's time for you to revisit the requirement for a college degree for many of the roles in your organization. A lot of the technical roles actually don't require a college degree to be done. And a lot of high growth venture backed startups are starting to do this, and they are attracting talent. They're also attracting talent because they're paying folks fairly. They're paying women comparable to men. They're providing equity and perks and resources to their team members. So more promotions and less press releases in HR. The next area of DAIS is in your procurement. If you're at the size where you are now hiring vendors and suppliers to help your business operate, be intentional about hiring Black companies, Latinx companies, veteran-owned companies, companies owned by LGBTQIA, and women-owned businesses. And think about intersectionality as well. I know we talk a lot about minorities and women, but it can send the message that there's minorities and then there's women. And there's Sojourner Truth. Remember what she said, I's a woman too. And so there needs to be some work there on that intersectionality. And then incentivize your talent teams and your procurement teams when they actually find diverse vendors. Next is in the area of corporate innovation, particularly those that are developing software products or have physical and tangible products. A lot of us in the technology ecosystem, we sort of joke and say, well, you know, there've been some Black folks on the teams at Uber and Airbnb, and not just to pick on them, but they've been in the public. You know, they know that you might run into some issues being Black trying to check in a, you know, all white neighborhood. The product team would have thought about that and could have had some policies in place. You know, I still, before COVID, would have challenges, you know, maybe catching a cab in DC and New York. And this was before the beard, of course. And, you know, perhaps it could be how someone's name is articulated or spelled, and people can make biased judgments. You have to think about those things in terms of your product development. For those who are building products with artificial intelligence and machine learning and quantum, you have to think about how they could be harmful to people of color, because there were not a lot of people of color allowed or hired or working on those products. And therefore the folks building them were not thinking about how could these solutions be harmful to community. So you have to think about that. You have to think about the climate. You have to think about, is your product harmful to society, harmful to people in society? And developing an ethics and fairness framework is going to be key for product development as we move forward in the fourth industrial revolution. Then here's your go-to-market. You know, perhaps there are other customers, whether you're enterprise or B2C for consumers. Maybe there are customers that you're not capturing because you're not targeting your marketing to Black businesses. The largest growth of new businesses in America are actually businesses founded by Black women. And if you're not talking to Black women business owners, you're missing out on market share. Go-to-market is incredibly important because people consume different media. We know social media can be targeted as well. And so you could spend a lot of time and a lot of resources, and you should be double clicking on how your go-to-market strategy works. For the firms that have grown successfully, we saw a lot of this last year where there was new investments. We saw we saw PayPal make a $500 million investment in Black venture capitalists. We saw other companies like Motley Fool, we saw Foot Locker, we saw Lowe's, Bank of America, different companies that were making investments out of their treasury. So this is not charity. These were investments into Black fund managers because they know when you invest in Black fund managers, or they learned rather, that capital is more likely to reach more Black entrepreneurs. And often measurement also is when you hear big announcements, 5 million, 10 million, 500 million, you also want to make sure you look at the size of the company and what they often invest to make sure that their investment was not performative, but it indeed was sacrificial because of the return thesis that they want to receive. And then, of course, there's community impact. There's been a lot done in the areas of corporate social responsibility, ESG. My colleagues and I believe that DAIS qualifies for ESG, and that racial equity, operationalizing racial equity across these areas in your respective business would drive economic output and are socially responsible. And so if you think about it, most as I wrap up here, most diversity, equity, and inclusion is centered around one person or a small team that's under-resourced, and is usually being asked to solve all of the challenges reactively in an organization. There may be affinity employee resource groups, of course, which should not be asked to do internal and external DAIS work for free, because this work is a science, this work is hard, this work comes with a skill set. And so ultimately, until organizations fund these respective areas inside of their organization, they put strain on their diversity, equity, inclusion departments. And that's why there's a lot of turnover in that respective area. So thank you for listening this morning to our explanation around DAIS, and I look forward to our further conversations. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Rodney. You've clearly hit a nerve here. We're getting a lot of engagement, both on the chat and in the Q&A. This is clearly something that is on top of mind for everyone. So let me just start our conversation, and please, I encourage everyone to continue to put stuff up on the Q&A. Let me start by something, you both said something very interesting, potentially could be viewed as conflicting. Amy, you said, what we're seeing now is not a fad. And Rodney, you started your conversations by saying, are we concerned about this being performative and things are just not working? So I'm curious to get a sense from both of you, is this different? Are we in a different moment, or have we seen this before?
Rodney, why don't you start?
Brilliant leader.
I delegate well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you look at history and you look at, I could go back as far as, emancipation of, Southern slaves in the South, and, the time between emancipation to Juneteenth, Texas getting the memo and deciding, to really, let the enslaved newly, citizens from African descent free. But if you look at the years of Reconstruction, the 10 years of Reconstruction before deconstruction, before Jim Crow, I would say that there were efforts by white allies, and I like to say white accomplices, and Brad Feld and I say co-conspirators in this work, that there have been periods where there's been like intentionality for a sustained period of time around creating equity as it relates to past and present, present day bias and discrimination and racism in America. And we saw this in the civil rights movement with Dr. King. We've seen these at different periods because the fight, for equity for Black Americans didn't just stop after emancipation. There was Reconstruction, then there was Deconstruction, and then there was states' rights, and then there was the fight for fair housing and the fight for education, and there was the GI Bill. If you follow policy as a precedence in this country, you'll see how through policy there's been some equity, and then you'll see where the private sector, the reason we have historically Black colleges and universities is because some wealthy white ally in most cases would help to start it and to help to fund it. So we've seen this in American history. And what we saw last year, we saw a lot of commitments. Some commitments still have to be delivered. And I'll give you case in point. There was a lot more capital last year that went into Black fund managers and into Black founders. And by reading the press releases, you would think that the problem was solved. But when the National Venture Capital Association put out their 2020 report, even with all of the influx of new capital into the Black tech ecosystem last year, there was more capital invested in startups in general. And so there was less capital in 2020 that went into Black startups. So if you look at it proportionally, it looks big, and it's great, it's admirable, but we still have so much work to do. And so I guess the challenge is, let's not make 2020 a performative year. Let's make it just, par for the course. It's just what business is. It's just what society is, with a focus on equity and parity for all.
Yeah. Amy, what about at the city and the community level? Is this different?
Yeah.
Has there been this level of coordinated, concerted effort by the business community?
Yeah, Mickey, I think that I think this is not a punt to your question, but I think there is an and. I think the and is that at the really high level, national level, there's a little bit of performance, a lot of announcements and press releases. Again, some of them obviously a good start and laudable, but I think the question is, how deep does it go inside a community where people live, where you can feel the difference? And that's where we are. Structural inequality is not macro. Structural inequality is in the systems, the interrelated systems inside a city, a region, a neighborhood that creates oppression and exclusion. And so to unlock that has to be at the regional level. So for me, I feel what the past year has done is accelerated genuine discussions that center race in economic development and real deep interest by business leaders to take this head on at the local level, because you can't escape it. There's something about the local level you can't avoid. Your partners, your allies who are holding you accountable to make an economy that works for everyone, to share power, to change who's at the table, to change the way you partner. The credibility of business leaders and economic development leaders is actually tested right now. It's been tested before 2020. It's even more so today. And I feel there's a whole set of leaders that are embracing what this reform requires in a deep way. I'll just say that this paper, which I wrote in spring, came because of a response from inquiries I was getting from groups around the country. And I was part of a conversation a couple of weeks ago where two local African-American leaders basically said, this moment feels different. As much as I would like to say this is a fad, they have never experienced this level of deep intentionality and explicit conversation among what you would call the establishment class to change their behaviors and practices and to really inquire what they need to do differently. And it takes time. So this is not as Rodney said, this is not a rush. And I think for all of you here joining us, progress takes time. But the way progress, someone has always said you need to start slow to move fast. And in this conversation where we've had generations of stalled progress, if you will, is it has to be genuine, authentic in order for accelerate. Because if you move fast with a lot of just high level words that don't mean anything, it'll sputter out. And so I think a lot of people, I think, are trying to do the hard work at the front end, and I hope that's what you all are doing together as a community too.
So one more sort of high level question, we'll get into some specifics. I wonder if the progress and sort of falling back or stalling that you're talking about comes back to this fundamental belief. You use the word share, and you use the word inclusive growth and inclusive prosperity. I wonder if one of the challenges that we have is that it's the fundamental belief, is actually buying into the fundamental belief that progress for one is not at the expense of another. This idea that really it is, we're only hurting ourselves if we're not helping other groups rise. What do you think about that? Do you think that this, as I mentioned this at the outset, Heather McGhee's book on the sum of us, this idea of a zero sum perspective, do you feel like that's one of the fundamental mindset shifts that individuals, collectives, and society has to come to in order to really make this sustainable?
Yeah, I think that I really appreciate that Heather put that book out, because we do need to push back on the perception that there's a winner or loser in this. At the national level, and even some of the lawsuits we're seeing, is that if you're explicit by race, you're hurting somebody else.
Right.
Here's what I would say when it comes to economic growth. If you invest in the hidden potential of a Black or brown entrepreneur, or a female entrepreneur, or a worker, right? The pie will grow. And when the pie grows, there's more slots, and there's more investment, and there are more jobs, and there are more opportunities. And so everyone will have a shot, including white workers, right? And when we argue about increasing representation, we're not saying everyone has to be Black and Hispanic in these job openings. What we're saying is, boy, we're asking you to go from 4% to 8%, which that's it. And heck, that takes a lot of intention. And you can argue that doubling the representation of Latinos in computer math occupations from 4 to 8%, right, is itself not enough, right? That's how far behind we are. And that still means 70, 80% of those jobs are being filled by others, right? This is about increasing the competitiveness of the economy. It's about adding more growth so that everyone has a chance. It's really hard to have equity when the pie is shrinking. What we're arguing is that investing in overlooked populations and business owners actually will grow the pie that is going to help everyone. That is a win-win.
Rodney, do you see this within organizations? You mentioned that when people talk about increasing representation, you say, well, as long as they're qualified. Nobody asks that when we have more majority people in a particular job where we try to increase, right? It's only raised when we talk about increasing brown and Black representation. But do you see the sense that, and we saw it in this ESPN controversy over this one, journalists that, well, yes, we want to have representation, but no, I want my job to stay, right? Do you see that dynamic play out?
You know, it plays out in industry, it plays out in the tech ecosystem, it plays out just in society in general. And I think a part of the reason it's playing out is because the concept of lack or, poverty has been politicized. I remember, reading about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his experiences while he was in the Birmingham jail, where he wrote the infamous letter from a Birmingham jail. And in conversations with the deputies and the sheriffs, it was like, wait, we have the same mission. We have the same cause. We should join forces. And it's interesting that folks, look at industry and work as a pie versus an ocean. And what we're seeing, if you just, some stuff you just got to learn. If you study and learn and see just how the American economy has continues to grow, and particularly, I focus majority of my time in the technology sector. 40 years ago, no one was talking about trillion-dollar companies, like, you know, they just continue to evolve and continue to grow. And so I think a lot of it is kind of readjusting our mindsets more towards the ocean versus the pie. And then if you think about it, the folks who have the resources that could actually cause the change of like creating more jobs, funding more businesses, you know, they shouldn't have those mindsets. I mean, why are they operating with lack unless it's, you know, one of greed? And so, you know, fundamentally understanding that when you look at sort of this, I still want my job, and it's like, well, of course you'll have your job. There's always, you know, more roles being, you know, being created. So I think if we can adopt that mindset, and maybe it's being more transparent with people in companies so that they can see this data and actually know that increasing representation of jobs that aren't filled does not mean that I'm going to lose my job.
You know, it's interesting. We're at a moment where organizations, corporations are scrambling to get talent, right? We see shortages everywhere. Do you feel like this is kind of a golden opportunity when organizations are really, really looking for folks to kind of out of necessity now to go after talent pools that they haven't fished in before? Do you find this, we're really at a critical moment here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, go ahead, Amy.
I was going to say, Mick, and I want to answer by responding to some of the questions that are in the Q&A or the chat.
Yes.
You know, a lot of the requests I get right now is from CEOs, literally just directly CEOs who are aware of two pressures to fill jobs, pressure to show up in this moment with diversity, equity, inclusion, and not knowing how to square those two goals, which they should be absolutely aligned. And what we're seeing in examples I didn't show today, like in San Diego, where the majority of it's a binational region, it's a growing region. It's got like San Diego, Austin, a bunch of these places in the South. You know, there are more job openings today post COVID than before COVID because of the dynamism within the tech and digital sector. And in San Diego, which is a binational region, they're super aware that for their companies to be dynamic in the long run, their tech ecosystem, their software industry has to reflect the Latino population, which is the majority of that community. How do you do that? Someone in your chat said, well, I don't see a lot of Latinos in management or some of these tech positions that can't afford a four-year degree. How do you do this? What's happening is a lot of these companies, as Rodney even affirmed, they're recognizing that you don't need someone to have a four-year degree. So first of all the job openings still automatically peg a BA requirement, which automatically locks out a whole set of workers. Second, they recruit only from four-year colleges. Yet the opportunity right now is to partner with community colleges or HBCUs too as a four-year institution. But think outside of the box. That's what Chicago did with the apprenticeship program. And what they did was in San Diego, all the employers now, because of their pledge to invest in more diverse local workforce, they set a goal too, is they hire first generation students that go to community college in entry-level IT positions. They train them in-house. And then, because they know in order to survive in a Northrop Grumman or any other defense IT industry, you do have to have a four-year degree. They then pay these young people to finish their degree work towards that four-year degree so they can stay in the company. That is the co-investment that we need to make. And it's not saying you don't need a four-year degree. It's saying we're going to invest in you when you have some credentials, and we're going to help you stay competitive by investing in your continued education. All of our workplaces have some form of tuition reimbursement or scholarships and training. This is one way to do it for entry-level workers and creating pathways in these growing industries. And I think there's enormous excitement in companies like that for doing that kind of partnership.
You know, it's really interesting. I guess what you're suggesting is corporations are realizing that societal goods like investments in education are an externality that they're having to now participate in because they realize that
Yeah.
they benefit from society's investments in education in order to get an educated workforce. Rodney, I'm curious whether you feel like this talent shortage is creating an even greater sense of urgency and a willingness to think differently about this issue.
You know, America is entering an age of rapid upskilling, reskilling.
Mhm.
Like it is probably the next decade or two and beyond. We're going to see more programs like boot camps. We're going to see traditional higher educational institutions or community colleges that are also saying, you know, here's a certificate program. It's 6 years, 6 months rather. We can train you as a cybersecurity specialist, or you know, in 2 months we can train you as a software sales person, full stack Python developer. You know, 4 to 6 months. And so this rapid reskilling is an amazing opportunity for industry to actually own that. I think right now we're looking to like philanthropy or income sharing agreements so that the private equity markets are funding a lot of education. I would like to see industry own that, because if industry owns it, it also helps you with your recruitment, right? You know, you help someone complete a skill through a boot camp or a certificate or a degree program, then they're going to look to you first for an opportunity. So it gives you an edge on hiring. So you can leverage like your dais and your impact to fund education, and it helps your talent team source more information, source more diverse talent.
You know, having said all that, as this is a golden opportunity and there's an increased sense of urgency, and given what you just said about the technological change and upskilling, at the same time, we're seeing a really marked K-shaped recovery, right? We're seeing a greater divergence. So I'm curious, Amy, if you were to extrapolate those wealth gaps, are we actually going to see a huge increase in the gap as a result of the changes in wealth that we have seen accumulate to one group versus another during the pandemic?
I think what's so interesting right now is how much shuffling there is going on in the workforce, in the labor force. The K-shaped recovery is in part about the structure of the occupations too, right? If you're the digital rich and digital occupations and digital industries, you're doing well. If you're a frontline worker in a grocery store, a restaurant, a other local serving business with really unstable pay or hours, that's more vulnerable. And what's so interesting is that a lot of the workers who have been mostly on the bottom of that K-shaped recovery are now demanding different outcomes. They're not going back into the restaurant industry. They're asking for better pay. They're looking for a better pathway. The one thing they've also realized is they just want to shift into better, solid careers with better income. And it goes back to, if we have a private sector that can't seem to find workers and yet also want their workforce to reflect society, this is the moment to partner in community differently and to be intentional about that. And so we kind of push back against the shape. And the other is, employers, I think we've seen this in other places, are realizing that they don't want to contribute to a proliferation of low wage work. Making 45% of workers today earn too little to support their families. And my fear is, as we move away from manufacturing towards a total services economy, is that we're proliferating low wage service work. And so companies have a responsibility themselves to look at their own career ladders and their pay structures and ask, are we contributing? Are our entry level positions, you know, forcing someone to still collect food stamps? Do we need to upgrade? So that would provide a more enormous societal benefit. And in our work in Indianapolis, 2 major statewide employers completely changed their wage structure when they found out that they had jobs that paid below a family sustaining wage in their entry level positions. And they ended that, you know, and restructured all their pay scales because of it. And that's in healthcare, and that's in financial services. You know, we can do more in every way.
Yeah, I think I read a headline, I didn't get a chance to read the article, that minimum wage doesn't pay enough to afford rent in most metro areas right now. Rodney, any thoughts on this, whether you really feel like your focus on the fourth industrial revolution and the need for having more technological skills. And we saw that during the pandemic, those benefits accrued to those digitally literate and those with those skills. Yet we see the gaps in access to those kinds of opportunities. What are your thoughts? Where will we go from here?
Real live experiences. OHUB has upskilled over 400 people in the last 6 years. We've had people when they came through our programs, they were working as janitors, had to withdraw from college because of financial reasons, or had gotten in trouble with the law a little bit, little stuff, but they got overly criminalized for it. And now they're software developers working at Emory University. I speak specifically about Corey Shaw, who had to withdraw from Morehouse. He was a janitor. He got into our program. He graduated. He got an engineering role at Emory. Emory had a co-op with Morehouse, so he was now able to go return to work at Morehouse at no cost. And he ended up finishing in the class of 2019 versus 2017, which was the year that Robert Smith paid all of the debt. And so, we've got countless stories of people who've been working in quote unquote blue collar roles that now are software developers. And last year in the pandemic, we graduated nearly 50 people, all virtual, and are working for software companies remotely. And so I think it's an incredible opportunity for upskilling and reskilling people who come from all types of backgrounds. We had lawyers, corporate lawyers that have been Harvard trained, that went through our software development boot camp, not so much because they want to become engineers and take a pay cut, but they want to start a legal tech company, right? So you have a lot of opportunities. I think despite everything we had to survive as a society in 2020, there's definitely some lemonade that came from the lemons, but I think we have to double click and scale on that.
So clearly by the audience and the comments, we see there's a lot of people who want to do something. They want to make a difference. So Amy, in your work with cities and communities, and Rodney, in your work with organizations, part I think what makes it difficult for people to initiate action is to sort of paralyzed with what do I do? So can you give us a sense of what do you see as sort of the highest leverage practices? So when, for example, Amy, when you look at those different communities where they actually did take effective action, was there something in common across those that actually made that work? What are the sort of the one or two things that you would advise somebody to start with?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on this, and I would welcome Rodney's experience too, working in Kansas City and other markets. So one is, I think you do need to set some goals. I think that you need, and it could be just one. Just like Milwaukee just said, we're going to focus on employment goals and representation. And I think sometimes people get paralyzed by the strategy. And sometimes if you just set the goal, it actually creates a North Star for a lot of people, and they start to brainstorm around it. It starts to focus the conversation. It creates a priority. It creates also a new alignment of partners, right? People who come to the table. So I think that actually setting a visible goal actually animates the conversation in the civic community. And so don't be afraid to do that, even if you don't know the how, but be very clear where we want to go, and then we'll work on the how. And then at the second thing is, you're not going to convince every employer that this is what they're going to do, but you need a nucleus of some pioneers and champions of this initiative. Start with 10. Birmingham did 10 CEOs. They're not trying to boil the ocean. They're not trying to create a completely inclusive strategy. 10 most formidable companies to start demonstrating the behavior and once the 10 start, their peers start to go, maybe I need to be part of that table. Why is that CEO talking about it? Maybe there's something, a rationale that I'm missing. You need a group of champions that are really respected to drive the work in the beginning. Find those champions and then staff it, right? And start somewhere. And I think it will lead to like a lot of really beautiful things. I will just say San Diego set 3 hairy goals around inclusive talent, around quality jobs and small businesses, because mostly small business ecosystem, and the affordability, because San Diego is so hard. 37,000 families being able to afford to stay there for childcare, affordable housing. When they set those goals as a civic community, all of a sudden the committee started to form. People came up with their own commitments. It created a marketplace of civic initiatives that the staff didn't even anticipate. And that's, I think, the opportunity when you set a community table around some collective action. I think really beautiful things begin to happen.
Rodney?
Going back to Kansas City, I'll give a couple of examples of what different communities are doing. In Kansas City, we're partnering with their civic council of 80 CEOs. And later this month, we are announcing an initiative to get more Black and Brown folks on boards of for-profit companies and into the C-suites. It's a very intentional initiative. So really excited about that. Also, I saw one of the questions there about, and I'll answer this kind of as an example, Black businesses feeling like they're over-mentored and under invested. One of the things that the chamber and the tech ecosystem in Richmond could do is give the governor a call and say, hey, I hear the Biden administration has renewed and funded the SSBCI, the State Small Business Credit Initiative, and state of Virginia qualifies to get $200 million. And we'd like for 30% of that to be allocated towards Black startups and Black businesses. Like, it's just that simple, like do something. And so if you adopt the DAIS framework, you could say, oh my God, I can't do something at all 7 today, but maybe I'm going to pick procurement and talent. And these are the areas of DAIS that we're going to work on, and we're going to set goals, because if you don't measure it, you won't meet it. Inside of organization, we set sales goals. How much monthly RR, recurring revenue, and ARR that we want to create. If we don't establish those goals, it's hard to get sales and BD folks to meet it. So you have to set DAIS goals inside of your company, and you also have to set those goals inside of kind of a broader coalition as well.
Since you mentioned that question about Black businesses being over-mentored, underinvested, and that came from one of our leaders in the Richmond area in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, he also asks about one of the challenges that Black-owned and minority-owned businesses is access to capital.
Yeah.
Oftentimes businesses start with credit card, friends, family, right? That's usually the first source of access to capital. And given the wealth gap that we showed across different communities, that's not available oftentimes. So he asks, what can you do? What have you seen as a successful way of building capital and getting capital to the hands of entrepreneurs and underinvested? Which is sort of what you're all about. So I'm curious.
Yeah, capital formation is key to what we're about. I go back to like the whole conversation about family and friends and using credit cards. We've supported dozens of Black high growth businesses in their equity crowdfunding. Using the Jobs Act, the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, equity crowdfunding can be a solution there. And we saw an uptick in founders, Black founders last year raising millions using equity crowdfunding. So that can address that. The second thing is we also got to understand that different capital works with different types of businesses. Venture capital only represents 3% of all, the capital in kind of the macroeconomic investment stack in America. Even though it's fueling 60% of net new jobs, venture capital flows to a certain type of business. Every business may not qualify for venture capital, but I do believe that, again, through like SSBCI, or even companies in the region could say, we're going to put together a convertible debt fund. We do this in the tech community all the time, where we'll issue convertible notes, unsecured convertible notes that convert into equity at a point where there are milestones in the business. So you could create a small convertible note fund or a large convertible note fund that businesses that demonstrate that they're fundable. And I like to have a balanced conversation if I can. Also, Yes, Black businesses are definitely over mentored and underinvested. I'm also a huge proponent of what I call the science of company building. Before I go ask anyone for money, I'm ahead of the game. I know what product market fit is. I know what it costs for me to get a customer. I know what my use of proceeds are. And people with good ideas don't automatically know how to build a company. So I do think there is something to be said for like pre-accelerator programs, incubator programs, acceleration programs that have investment at the end. We do need more of those in the ecosystem, period. And we need the capital to also match. So I don't think it's one versus the other, but founders can get frustrated when they get a meeting with a venture capitalist and the venture capitalist is like, well, I want to mentor you and not write a check. And venture capitalists, our job is to write checks, not to mentor.
Interesting. I want to ask in the 3 minutes we have left, the flip side of the earlier question that I asked in terms of the highest leverage activity or action somebody could take. The flip side of that, given your experience working with cities, communities, and organizations, what have you seen as the biggest pitfall, barrier, excuse, whatever you might want to call it, that individuals should be on the lookout for, and how might you overcome that? Where have cities and communities failed, or where have they really gone wrong, or what has been the in organizations in your work, or even into your entrepreneurial ecosystem?
Well, I'll chime in first. I was interested. I've been looking at some of the announcements around the American Recovery Funds, just to keep it present, right? And I see monies going into like old narratives. I don't see our political leaders like putting in the hard work, although I know that they have all worked hard just to keep us afloat and to survive over the last year and a half or so. But when I see like $200 million going into the same programs that have yielded the same results, and I don't have to give the definition of insanity. Fraud gave the definition of insanity. I think we need to do new things, and so I think we need to have like a national exposure session on what are some of the new cutting edge programs and methodologies. Every city in America needs, Amy's report, right? I think they could look at our DAIS framework. Last year, we worked on how to spur racial equity through tech ecosystems in cities. So there are new methodologies for the future. Like these high growth companies are not subscribing to kind of like the old models. Like no one does a business plan. Everyone does a business model canvas now. Folks do an executive summary. They don't do a prospectus, and so the world has changed in terms of narratives and how-tos. And I think it's time for our cities and municipalities to catch up to that if we're going to be competitive as a country going forward.
Amy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think Rodney's right. And we don't have time, but there is funding available right now. I don't know if we have city or government officials on this call with us, but we do have $350 billion in AR rescue plan dollars on the streets to put a down payment on an equitable recovery. What I fear, and many people fear, is we're going to put those dollars in the same old programs, as Rodney said. And one of the things I was thinking about is, as part of this conversation, is every community has a summer youth jobs program, and they may decide to double it in a moment where there's pressure to address the rising sense of violence in our communities, right? Well, what if we use that summer youth program and not just double it and fund it the same way, take it and turn it into a year-round paid internship program with employers, and bring the community college in that maybe there is a credential that they can access at the same time. Cities have this huge opportunity to grab a whole bunch of young people really eager to be productive and get work and be paid and find employment and contribute and do something different with that, and that's the opportunity. And I think what happens a lot of time is speed of results means easy status quo conversations, programs, tables. So this takes time. This means listening and engaging differently. It may mean leading different organizations to lead the work. Um, Having different voices design the strategies than what you have traditionally done. And I would say for chambers and economic development leaders, it's different metrics for success, not just job creation, job creation, job creation, but are the people in our community doing better? Are we investing in existing talent and existing businesses and not just focusing on new recruiting new people and talent in? And that's a change in behavior. That's a change in goal. That's a change in a whole bunch of strategies. That is the shift we're making. But if you're just using the words equitable development and you're still doing attraction work and measuring yourself against job creation, that you're actually not doing the work that's being required here. And so, but I actually feel very positive that the field is evolving. And that's, again, the real leadership opportunity that Chamber RVA and a bunch of others, I think, can do in this moment.
Yeah, thank you. You know, being a parent of 2 college students, this generation won't let us get away with doing the same old, same old. They really are in a different place. And I think that we would be wise, and this is why I love to do what I do, being in a college environment, we'd be wise to listen and to learn from their dissatisfaction with doing the same. Amy, Rodney, I can't thank you enough. We can't thank you enough for your time, your insights, your expertise. Our community really is richer for everything you have brought to us. I just have a couple of quick takeaways. It seems to me that the business imperative for DEI is undeniable. I think we need to move beyond that. There is no question about that. And I think that the lack of progress that we have seen and the status quo makes action an imperative. We really can't sit around and not do something. And there appears to be a will. I think it's pretty clear from what we've seen here and the work that you all do, that there is a will. Now we need to take intentional action. I think you gave us some really good advice, having concrete goals, having a focus, bringing different voices, different people into the table. And I think the last point that was made here is to get educated. Instead of going to the same old habits that we've gone to, we need to actually learn and we need to actually get educated. And obviously this session today was part of that educational process. So thank you again. Thanks everyone for attending. I'm going to turn it over to Brian for some closing thoughts.
Well, like you, Dr. Quinones, Amy, Rodney, we could not have asked for a better start to our second set of conversations. This follows a year of us doing a lot of soul searching and thinking and designing our own framework with a lot of information from great leaders like you all. Now it's time for action. And Mickey summed up many of those thoughts just as that I would have liked to have done, but for sake of time, I won't go further. Mickey, thank you for a phenomenal job as moderator. We have a permanent opening for a regular moderator, so you're welcome to join us anytime. I'll just throw a couple of thoughts out there that I think are important for us to have heard from our leaders. First, we've got to move from conversation to action. We've all known that. We've got to tell ourselves that regularly. We've got to move from aspirations to intentionality. It's nice to have good feelings and to be inspired, but it has to turn into intentional action to get things done. And then third, I love what Rodney said. We got to quit doing what doesn't work, quit doing what we've always done, and really be entrepreneurial and innovative in our work as we go forward to make this happen. So thanks for all participating. The work we've done the last year is create a lot of conversations that now is moving into focus groups, listening to you all along with our business leaders so that we can very quickly put out a scorecard or a dashboard around where we are in the current situation and then moving to action to make those numbers better. Coming forward, we've got 2 more sessions coming up. We'd love to have you be a part of. The next one's going to be the Corporate Coalition of Chicago, an alliance of Chicago area CEOs who are implementing new ways for businesses. That'll be on July 29th at 9:30. Then our third session will be 2 weeks later on August 12th, partnering with the Greater Washington Partnership. Thanks for being with us today. We appreciate you all being a part of this conversation, and we look forward to making Richmond the most inclusive region in the country. Have a wonderful and blessed day.